Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure you follow and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, make sure to visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. You can sign up for the newsletter over there and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media, because it's important that the American people know what's going on. You know, ordinary Americans, a lot of times, they don't really pay attention. They don't focus on politics, but politics is an important part of our lives. It's not the only part of our lives. It's a sliver of our lives, right? But it directly impacts each and every one of us. And before I jump into today's episode, I just want to make a few announcements because I have to switch things up a bit. Usually I drop the interview episodes on Monday, but given that we have the debate on Tuesday, I am going to do my monologue episode today. I will drop an interview episode on Wednesday, and I have a great guest coming on. We're going to talk about 9/11, so be sure to check it out. Then on Thursday, I'm going to drop another episode where I will provide my thoughts, analysis. I'm going to break down the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I want to talk about the implications on this presidential election, if there's going to be any. But today's episode is really going to be important because I want to focus on something that's really been on my mind these last few years, especially with the 23rd anniversary of 9/11 that's just around the corner. I mean, 23 years. Think about that. Every single person that was alive can remember exactly where they were that day. Every single person. They know to the very minute details of what they were doing when they first heard about the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center. Many of you out there, you lost loved ones, you lost friends, and America lost a piece of itself that day. And we've all heard the phrase, never forget. I mean, that was the slogan that came about, that we can never forget what took place on 9/11. But I can't help but feel that over the years, we have forgotten. We've forgotten what took place. We've forgotten how we felt. We've forgotten about the greatness of America. And it's sad, but it's also dangerous. Now, I'm not talking about the remembrances or the ceremonies. We still do those. And for those people that lost loved ones, it's even more important for them. I'm talking about how we have moved away from the core meaning behind the phrase, never forget. What it represents in our society. You know, back in the days and months immediately following the attacks, there was a deep sense of unity, a sense of patriotism, an understanding of what was at stake. It was a time when our country came together, not just to mourn the lives lost, but to stand strong in defense of our freedoms, our values, our identity. There was a commitment to ensure that something like this would never happen again. We were united in a certain sense of purpose. We were united in love of country. People had pride in America. Patriotism and love of country, they weren't seen as some far right-wing extremist ideology. It was an American value that transcended political divisions, a belief in the greatness of the nation, and a commitment to defending the principles of freedom, liberty, selflessness, and resilience. But here we are, 23 years later, and so much has changed. The feelings have evaporated. Now, things like the American flag and patriotism, they're seen as triggers or ultra far right. We, the people, have lost our sense of purpose, and so too has the government. So too has America. We've grown increasingly authoritarian. It seems somewhere we went off the rails, and the significance of 9/11 has faded for many, especially the younger generation, when we now live in a time where students were actually born after 9/11. They never knew what a pre-9/11 America was like. They don't know what a pre-9/11 world is like. They didn't experience the shock, the fear, the grief that we all felt. For them, it's just another chapter in the history books, a tragic event. But they're disconnected from the emotional reality of that day and how the world changed on that day, how America changed on that day. And I'm going to explain exactly what I'm talking about when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So we're talking about the idea of never forget, how after 9/11, never forget was part of our lives. And over the years, it seemed to have drifted away, right? I believe a large part of the problem is how our education system has approached teaching about 9/11 and our history as a whole. There's no doubt about it. There's been a shift in how students are taught about America, our values, our struggles, our achievements, instead of reinforcing important concepts. A lot of students are fed a steady stream of anti-Americanism where they're told that America is a deeply flawed, oppressive, racist country. And I always say, there's a big difference between those on the left and myself. See, on the left, they are quick to demonize America, and they want the government to right every single wrong that has existed. They view America as the actual problem. Me, on the other hand, I view the government as the problem. I routinely criticize the government. I call the government out for its abuses. I call out the politicians and the bureaucrats. However, I constantly promote American ideals. I promote American values. I promote the American identity because I believe in America. I believe in the idea of America. I believe in the vision of the founding fathers and what they were trying to create. And I understand the complexity of our history. It's an interesting difference. And many of them are blind to their own hypocrisy, where they want to empower the very government that they accuse of being oppressive, of being racist. So it's just bizarre in my mind. But getting back to 9/11, part of the disconnect between the youth and 9/11 is generational. Part of it is a failed education system, and part of it is far more sinister. When the memory of something as significant as 9/11 fades, when we allow the memory to be diluted or worse, distorted, we risk losing a core part of what binds this nation together. Never Forget wasn't just about remembering the attacks. It was about remembering who we are as a peoples, what we stand for, what we're willing to fight for. It was about honoring the bravery of the first responders, of all those soldiers that were in the military or enlisted after 9/11 and served in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and so many other countries. It was about everyday citizens who rose to the challenge in the face of this tragedy that existed. Now, I've been in the classroom for nearly 2 decades. I know, I'm getting old. I had a lot of hair when I started. I started in 2006. That's when I began teaching, and I've observed a profound change in the way students perceive 9/11. When I first began teaching in 2006, my students were captivated by the lessons of 9/11. They had personal connections to that event. Some lost friends, some lost family members. Others were traumatized by the events of the day. They all could easily recall exactly where they were. They all understood the significance of the day, the impact it had on the United States, how the world changed forever. They were very emotional during these lessons, but in recent years, I've noticed a disturbing shift. They're still interested in the lesson of 9/11 and the way I teach it, but the emotional attachment is no longer there. The emotional engagement, it certainly waned, unless I have older students, those that are returning back to college after years for their careers or because maybe they were a stay-at-home parent and they want to further their education now. Without those adult students, the rest of the student body is not as engaged as they once were. They're disconnected from 9/11 the same way that my generation is disconnected from Pearl Harbor or the assassination of JFK. For those listeners that were alive during Pearl Harbor or JFK, I'm sure that you shed a tear when you heard about these events, and you can recall exactly where you were, just like I can recall where I was with 9/11. But for me, Pearl Harbor and the assassination of JFK, it was simply a moment in history, right? It was not a national trauma because I didn't go through it. It was a historical event that I read about in textbooks and I see on the History Channel. Well, that's how these students now view 9/11. But there is something more sinister at play here, and the disconnect isn't just a product of time passing, it's the result of an education system that has failed to impart the significance of 9/11 and instead has indoctrinated students with anti-Americanism. We see the growing detachment from the historical reality and the rise of anti-American sentiment throughout the entire country. They're deeply intertwined, and they stem from a deliberate effort to reshape how students view their own country. And that's the danger right there. The American education system at all levels has produced and continues to produce undereducated, radicalized individuals who are indoctrinated with anti-American sentiment. They're indoctrinated with disdain for Western culture and values. They're taught to be activists, not thinkers. And unfortunately, America is routinely denigrated in the process. They're told that we're a racist and oppressive country instead of instilling pride in the progress that we have made, the values that define us, correcting past wrongs. The idea of American exceptionalism is now seen as racist or bigoted, homophobic, misogynistic. It doesn't even make sense. But these people never make sense. And unfortunately, they're taught to view our own country with suspicion and contempt. That's the reality for many students today. 9/11 is taught in a way that's sanitized, and instead of focusing on the tragedy itself and the sacrifices that were made, the lessons we should have learned, there's this tendency to frame it within a narrative like anything else that it's America's fault. And I've seen curriculums where the focus shifts quickly to American foreign policy. The implication, like we brought it upon ourselves. And it's not just about 9/11. The shift goes far beyond. It extends far beyond 9/11. Over the past decade or so, the curriculum has increasingly been infused with anti-American rhetoric. The message being delivered to students is that America is a fundamentally flawed nation, a nation built on racism, slavery, inequality. And while it's important to teach the totality of American history, both the good and the bad, they constantly denigrate the United States. They constantly focus on America's shortcomings, rather than saying, look at where we started and look at how we were able to overcome. Look at how many people sacrificed to make America a better place. But instead, students are taught to be cynical of the United States, of America. Even teaching the United States has become controversial. This is the bizarre world we're living in. I want you to think, 673 university professors from the University of North Carolina signed a letter opposing legislation from the North Carolina state legislative body that would require students to take courses on America's founding and the Constitution. And they argue that it was a violation of their academic freedom. It's completely ridiculous. And we're starting to see the effects in real time. And I want to talk about that when we get back from a quick break. So everyone, hang tight and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So now, as a college professor, a political scientist, but most importantly, as an American, I have been warning that this real-world effect of the anti-American indoctrination that's been pushed for several years in our K-12 system and on our college campuses, that it is having a profound impact. And we could see the impact, right? 30% of Gen Z, according to a survey, 30% of Gen Z now believe that Osama bin Laden's ideas were justified. They view him as a force for good. That's 30%. You could sit there and argue all day long, well, that's not the majority. No, but 30% is a huge number, and it's actually growing. And that statistic should send shockwaves throughout this entire country. How the hell did we get to a place where a significant portion of young people can sympathize with one of the most notorious terrorists in modern history? But we have our answer, because it lies in the erosion of patriotism. Patriotism is constantly seen now as a right-wing ideology. We see the constant narrative that America is the villain on the world stage. Look at our college campuses. It's a disgrace what's going on. You have extremists that continue to disrupt learning, to push pro-Hamas propaganda. They hand out pamphlets that say death to America on them. Some even proclaim that they are fighting for the eradication of Western civilization. What the hell do you want to replace it with? That's what I want to know. Because when I look around the world, I'm not really envious of other places. Doesn't mean that we do everything perfectly, but guess what? We don't have slave auctions here in the United States. That's happening around the world. That happens in other regions around the world. So you want to replace Western civilization. What do you want to replace it with? Do you want to replace it with a civilization that still believes in stoning human beings, that throws gays from rooftops? Do you want to replace it with a civilization that taxes or kills anyone that doesn't think like them? Is that what you want to replace it with? Do you want to replace it with a civilization where little children, little girls are kidnapped and sold into the sex slave trade? Little boys are kidnapped and made child soldiers. Are we going to replace it with that type of civilization? Like, what exactly do they want to replace it with? I'd like to know. But they themselves don't know, because they are imbeciles. That's what they are. However, the growing radicalism, it's not like it's happening in a vacuum. It's the result of an education system that has strayed from its duty to teach historical truth and foster a love of country. Yes, people will be like, oh, it's propaganda that you're going to force students to have to learn to love their country, to promote America. That's propaganda. A country can't survive if its students are being taught to hate it. The whole basis for our public education system is to promote a love of country. James Madison argued that the diffusion of knowledge is the greatest guardian for liberty. John Adams argued that children should be educated and instructed on the principles of freedom. Benjamin Rush, let our common people be compelled by law to give their children a good education. This plan of general education will alone render the American Revolution a blessing to mankind. Noah Webster, every child in America should be acquainted with his own country. He should read books that furnish him with the ideas that will be useful to him in life and practice. As soon as he opens his lips, he should rehearse the history of his own country. Our founding fathers understood the importance of promoting America within an education system. It doesn't mean that we sanitize our history. It doesn't mean that we whitewash our history. And if more people don't begin to loudly speak out against the extremism, we will continue to allow these dangerous ideologies to fester and grow. The 30% that now are sympathetic to Osama bin Laden will only get larger. Silence and cowardice only serve to embolden those who call the Constitution trash like Eli Mistel. They only serve to those that openly state the goal is to dismantle the United States, which college professors have said. We as Americans have to counter this trend, and we have to reclaim the sense of patriotism that defines our nation. We can't afford to sit back and watch as anti-American sentiment spreads unchecked. It's not enough to just point out the problem. We need solutions, and those solutions start with our education system. You could ignore it all you want. You could think, well, my kids, they graduated, they're out of school. But guess what? Your kids are going to have kids that are going to go through this education system. You could think, well, that's why I don't put my kids in public school. That's why I homeschool them, or that's why I send them to private school. Well, good for you. But if the entire system collapses because all we're producing is anti-American zealots that despise the country, that are going to ultimately one day get into positions of power, and the whole system collapses on itself, it's not going to matter the education that you gave your child. It's not going to matter that they went to a private school. It's not going to matter that you homeschooled them. We need to fix the public education system. We have to reinstate a robust civics education program that teaches students about the values of freedom, federalism, limited government, individual responsibility. Students need to be able to pass a basic citizenship test by the time they get to me. Every single student, by the time they get to me, should not only have read the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States, they should have read it so much that they could easily paraphrase it. We need to remind students, we need to remind all Americans that America is an exceptional nation despite its flaws. That's why there's millions of people around the world that still look to our country as the beacon of hope and opportunity. If we were such a terrible nation, why would anyone want to come here? You don't see anyone trying to illegally cross into Venezuela, do you? Do you see anyone trying to illegally get into Cuba, North Korea, China? There's a reason people want to come here. And again, it doesn't mean ignoring the darker parts of our history. Students learn about slavery. Students learn about the Trail of Tears. Students learn about Japanese internment camps. Students learn about the American atrocities that we committed. What they don't learn about is the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States. They don't really learn about the Founding Fathers. They don't learn what makes America an exceptional nation. They don't learn about the tenets of the American creed that link us all together in this society. They have no idea what e pluribus unum, out of many, one comes from. They don't know what it means. They don't know why it's important in our society. They don't know what their civic obligations are, what their civic responsibilities are. And that's why we need a robust civics education program. We also need to celebrate, bringing it back to 9/11, we need to celebrate the heroes of 9/11, the first responders, the military personnel, the everyday Americans who rose to the challenge of that day in the face of tragedy, the bravery and sacrifice that every single American should be displaying. Unfortunately, too many are cowards. It's not just a tragic event that occurred. It was a moment where the best of America was on full display. And by doing this, by reintroducing this, we could reintroduce a sense of pride and duty to younger generations, remind them of the values that unite us in this country. And we need to encourage dialogue in this country. Too many college campuses have grown to become echo chambers where any type of dissenting opinions are silenced, they're marginalized, they're attacked, they're ridiculed. We have to foster an environment where students can debate and engage with different ideas and where the principles of free speech and academic freedom are upheld. If we do these things, we could start to rebuild the sense of the national identity that we seem to have lost, that's been slipping away. It's not too late. However, sitting back and doing nothing is not going to fix this problem. We have to act now. We have to preserve the values that make America great. And 9/11 is a great time to talk about them because it should serve as a crucial reminder of the importance of patriotism. We should emulate the bravery and the selflessness of the first responders and the soldiers who on 9/11 and in the days since put their lives on the line to protect every single one of you out there and myself. Protect our nation, uphold the very values that we are now at risk of losing because of radical ideologies and an overbearing government. The least we could do to honor the sacrifice of all those that lost their lives, 3,000 on 9/11, the over 5,000 first responders that have since died from 9/11, and Americans that were down on the scene, the construction workers, and the nearly 10,000 soldiers that came back in flag-draped coffins, fighting for us overseas, whether you agreed with the wars or not. The tens of thousands of soldiers that came back with life-altering injuries. See, it's that bravery, it's that selflessness that makes America great. And the least we can do to honor their sacrifice is to defend our American values in the face of those who are seeking to destroy them. That's the least we could do. Get involved, get engaged. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please leave the P.A.S. Report podcast a 5-star rating on any podcast platform that allows it. Take 30 seconds to write a review. As I stated at the beginning of this episode, I do have a great guest coming on to talk about 9/11 on 9/11. It's an episode that you're not going to want to miss. And on Thursday, I will be giving my thoughts and analysis on what took place at the debate between former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris and how it may have shifted the 2024 presidential election. So you're not going to want to miss that either. You get 3 episodes from me this week. See who's better than you out there. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.